Hello, Sabina Brennan here, host of Superbrain, the podcast for everyone with a brain. It takes just 30 seconds on Google or Apple Pay to make a one-off donation to support this show. Simply follow the Support This Show link in the show or episode description. Cheers. Hello and welcome to Superbrain, the podcast for everyone with a brain. My name is Sabina Brennan, and in this episode I continue my conversation with my former on-screen daughter Ruth Gilligan, the down-to-earth high achiever, about empathy and how walking in someone else's shoes can take us towards solutions to what ails society. We had a fabulous conversation and flipped from one fascinating topic to the next. We covered quite a range: motherhood and mad cow disease, identity and Irishness, tradition and modernity, integrity, what it means to be a woman, babies and borders. But time and again, we came back to the value of storytelling and empathy. Enjoy. I do want to talk about your impact work, which is pretty incredible. You work for Narrative 4. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, very gladly. Yeah, absolutely. So Narrative 4 is an organisation that was founded in about 2012, 2013 by the Irish writer Colin McCann, who is kind of a huge hero of mine in terms of his writing. I think he's he's my favourite author. And, I kind of love that he is from Dublin, pretty near where I grew up, but writes these books all over the world, different cultures, different portions of history, different little niches of society. And he's all about kind of, learning about others through stories and through literature. So I've always kind of admired his work. But yeah, I found out that he founded this organization. And basically what Narrative 4 does is it uses storytelling to bring together young people from different backgrounds and crucially to try and foster empathy. And they do this through their main kind of way of doing this is through something called the story exchange. And basically what that involves is bringing together two groups from different backgrounds, maybe different countries or different sides of the tracks or different parts of the same city or whatever. And they bring the two groups together and then everyone gets partnered off. And in your pairs, you would swap a story from your own life. So something that's somehow meaningful to you or defines you in some way. And then you come back to the group and you tell your partner's story back to the group in the first person. So I would say, hi, my name is Sabina. And when I was 16, this thing happened to me and this is how it's felt and it's the impact it's had on me. And you literally kind of imagine your way into your partner's story and quite literally kind of step into their shoes. So it's a really kind of simple methodology, but Narrative 4, Colin now lives in the States. So it's predominantly an American organization, but they're now doing this work all over the world, working with kids in the US, but also Mexico and South Africa and Palestine and Israel and Ireland. And I just think it's like a really kind of practical application of, the idea that stories can bring people together and can help us develop empathy and learn about the lives of others. So when I started my job as an academic myself in 2014, I just dropped Narrative 4 an email just to be like, hello, I love the sound of this. Can I get involved or what do I do now? And basically they were actually, as it happened, about to go to Belfast to do a story exchange between a group of girls from a Protestant school and a group of girls from a Catholic school. So they invited me along just to meet them all and then also to watch a story exchange in action. And the idea sounds great on paper, but to actually see it in practice and the impact it had on those girls and how they all arrived that morning to Ulster Hall and wouldn't even look each other in the eye. And then by the end of the day, how they were all laughing and talking and joking and finding all this common ground was just like so moving that I was like, yeah, I want in. And kind of ever since then, I've been working for the organisation and doing projects on their behalf in the UK and further afield. And I think they're amazing.
I think it's incredible and I think it's needed more now than ever. I mean, that lack of empathy, it's at the very root of prejudice and stereotyping and a part of how we have sort of divided society, along certain lines. And I mean, that can go anywhere from dividing males from females, but dividing blacks from white, or Catholics from Protestants, or, people from working class areas from people from middle class areas. And it leads to this othering. I think you talk about that as well. And I feel it strongly, sort of even in the area that I'm interested in. I think there's a terrible othering of older people, calling people the elderly, and even how they're talked about in the context at the moment as if they're somehow another species. They're just us when we're older. And it's because we sort of isolate them, and it's causing a problem too at the moment. We, put an awful lot of older people in nursing homes who probably don't want to be there and would rather live in the community if they had the proper supports there. But it's because people don't get the opportunity to connect. And, once people do connect on a human basis, then they start to see commonalities rather than differences. But the problem is society, as we've set it up, doesn't allow for that connection in any real or meaningful way. Generally when the connection happens, when the two sides, if it is that way, meet, it's usually at a point of conflict. And I think that's getting worse and worse because we have social media. So people don't even get to see each other in real life. And I think if you look at some of the trolling and comments on social media, they really could do with a dose of narrative 4, to
I agree.
To get some empathy.
Yeah, it's also worth mentioning that narrative 4 actually have a centre now down in Limerick.
They do actually. I read about that. That's the fantastic. I think, did you sort of lead that particular project? I read about it in The Guardian.
I was part of it. Yeah. So, I did a project in 2018 between a group of teenagers. I brought a group of teenagers from the UK over to Ireland, and we did a story exchange between them, which was amazing because, as you say, talking about a point of conflict, it was right around all the height of the Brexit discussions, and the English were saying all these things about the Irish, and the Irish were saying all these things about the English, and we were like, oh God, here we go again. So to get those teenagers in a room to just connect as human beings, regardless of where they're from, and realizing, as you said, there was so much common ground, was so timely and so important. And it's also worth saying that down in Limerick, they've got a permanent site there, Narrative Force, so they run very regular projects, and some of the work they do is between older members of the community and transition year students.
Oh, excellent. Because that was one of the questions I was going to ask you, because anything that I sort of read about it seemed to be sort of with younger people, and that's a critical point to do it. But I think we mustn't sort of give up. I mean, really, we could do it with people of all ages of the community around various different things. I mean, empathy, empathy is something that it's really kind of complex, but it's so critical and important. And in a way, what's really reassuring, about Narrative 4 is, it really does demonstrate in practice how empathy can be learned, and in a very moving way. I mean, really, when you read some of those stories, on these podcast notes, I'll place links to Ruth's website, and she has links out there to some of the projects. They're well worth a visit and a look. And people telling other people's stories, and being very moved by them as they're telling the story. You see, that's what's wonderful is, and I mean, in part that's the brain, and in part that's what real acting is about. Ruth, would you agree? It's not about pretending, it's about being.
Yeah, I agree. And I would also extend that, to be honest, also to do with writing, and even to do with reading. I think that, when you read a great book and you literally step into a character's shoes and you feel the texture of their world and their life, you're suddenly transported to being that person. And that's why I do truly believe that books and stories can allow you to develop your empathy in a way that very few things can.
But also importantly as well, in your self-awareness, because I think that's kind of linked with empathy as well. And it's linked with very Western in a way. We're very egocentric in how we view, the world, and culturally, or ethnocentric really, and part of that is our educational systems, where you're brought up, this is how we do it, this is it, where you're really just taught stuff. Instead, I would rather an educational system that taught us how to think critically. and, how to look and examine, well, actually, this is our history, but it's written by, it's written by us from our perspective. And, these are just moral standards, not the only moral standards. That these things are all sort of culturally developed. And I think that happens. And that's part of the problem, when you eventually, and I mean, the problem is how we respond, not multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is fantastic, but where the conflicts arise is from, people coming from a place that there is only one way, i.e. the way we were brought up and the morals and that we have, without understanding or even taking a moment to consider that, well, actually, these other people feel the exact same about theirs. And really, we need to just have more, as you said, empathy. And from there, you can have greater understanding and, where necessary, compromise as opposed to conflict. And I think that's what I find so challenging about social media is that, and also what you sort of see with current world leaders some of the current world leaders that we have is, and this is around language, is where it's interesting if you do analysis of language around conflict, around politicians, prior to great wars or to any kind of political conflict, the language becomes very simplistic and it becomes, it's bifurcated. It's just us and them. It's black or white. You're with us or you're against us. And there's no nuance and there's no colour. Whereas then if you actually analyse language coming up to, for example, where the Berlin Wall came down, where the Iron Curtain came down, those kind of things, or where you actually reach a peace agreement, you see much more colour in the language, much more depth, much more understanding. And I guess really what it is it's empathy and understanding cultural differences and realising that the only way forward is through that depth. And I think, unfortunately, we're reverting at the moment to a more us or them, certainly with some leaders that we have. But also, I do think social media feeds into that, because that seems to be the way on Twitter that, for example, where it can happen, you make a point and then it's like a pile-on of people who just disagree.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And there was a gorgeous, it's worth looking up, Obama made an incredible commencement speech in, I think it was 2004, where he talks about this idea. He says a lot of people talk in this country about the federal deficit, but actually I think we need to talk about the empathy deficit and our inability to put ourselves in the shoes of the laid off steel worker or the woman who cleans my dorm room or just other people whose experience might be different from ours, and our inability to imagine what life must be like for them, or crucially what my life would be like if I were them. We've just lost that ability, and that, as you say, is responsible for so many issues.
For so many things. And I think it works both ways. I think also what I find where there's lack of empathy too is that it is everything just comes down to economic status. Now, and people say, oh yeah, but it's all right for you in your position of where you have X amount of money or whatever. And absolutely no empathy for somebody who's famous, who maybe have mental health issues. And I think that's where you end up with actually somebody like Caroline Flack, that it's not a human being. And you know what? Hey, she's famous. She has all that stuff and she has the money that goes with it. And so we can say all sorts of things about her and there's not a human being there. Instead of actually going, you know what? Sometimes, and I've said this frequently, sometimes the more money you have, if you're susceptible to depression or anxiety, the greater your depression, because you've got everything that everybody has wished for. You can buy everything you want, but yet you still experience depression, because it's a mental health issue. And it can even be worse, because sometimes, at least with other people, they're saying, oh, if I only could do that. Yeah. If I only could have that, there's still sort of an essence of hope. But it is about sort of experiencing three-dimensional people as opposed to sort of cardboard stereotypes. And that takes me back into your most recent book, The Butchers, which is a fantastic read and very interesting characters. Although I think when because the context is something that I have never heard of before, it's kind of easy for that to take over. But the characters themselves are really, really fascinating. You want to tell us a little bit about the characters and the book itself?
Yeah, absolutely. So in a nutshell, the Butchers is, it's set in the Irish borderlands in 1996 during the BSE crisis. So I seem to be doing nothing but talking at the moment about how there may or may not be some parallels between that period and the research I did and the current situation. I think the characters are worth mentioning because it's set, there's 4 different points of view in the novel. There's a mother and a daughter and a father and a son. And the book is about many things. And one of the things for me that I think it's most crucially about is a kind of almost like a turning point in Irish history between Ireland kind of transitioning almost from a pretty old-fashioned nation into something a bit more modern. 1996 is the year the divorce legislation was in place. It's 3 years after homosexuality was decriminalized. The Celtic Tiger is beginning to roar, like the Troubles are nearly over. So it's moving into this new phase, into this kind of forward-looking progressive nation. But obviously, the past and the old ways aren't dead just yet. So that's why, as I said, I have these 4 points of view, the mother and daughter and the father and son, because it's about different generations and the tensions between those generations and kind of what is passed on between generations and what is lost for better or for worse. So those characters were a way for me to kind of examine the old way and the new way, and those two things rubbing up against each other.
But also, but also interesting in terms of, the particular butchers that you talk about, it's actually something that I never heard about. So it's even sort of, it's almost, was a hangover from a time way beyond way before 1996. I wouldn't have been aware that kind of thing was happening.
Yeah. So the Butchers, they're like a group of men who travel around Ireland performing this kind of ancient type of cattle slaughter, which, used to be very common, but most people have stopped believing in. But there still are some people who are clinging on to this old superstition or this kind of old folkloric ritual. So again, there's a lot of folklore in the book, because one of the things that really interests me about Ireland is that, even now, there is a lot of superstition and folklore and myth and legend that we kind of hold on to, even, as I said, as we are kind of a forward-looking, progressive, modern country. And that tension between tradition and modernity is kind of fascinating to me. So the Butchers themselves as a group, you've got, on the one hand, you've got them, and then on the other hand, you've got this kind of very real life, the BSE crisis, the implication that was having on the Irish economy, Irish politics. So it's kind of fact and fiction, it's folklore and real life political events rubbing up against each other. So yeah, there's a lot going on.
And very, very interesting female characters in it too,
Yeah, that was really important to me. I think there's, the Irish rural canon has a lot of great books. I think someone like McGahern, or even the poetry of Patrick Kavanagh, we've got some really great male writers writing about rural Ireland and life on farms and even in the borderlands. But I was just really conscious that there aren't enough of them with female voices, and what are the farmers' wives doing? What are they up to, and how do they fit into this picture of isolation and transition?
Yeah, and I find that interesting too. It's kind of in a way around identity. So much of what we think, can be influenced by, stories that mightn't even be true, And when that comes to identity, and I know you're interested in, cultural boundaries, and something that fascinates me is like Irishness. What is Irishness? The whole nation state things is really only a few hundred years old. That's why I always feel we're human before we're anything else. And that, I think, is where something like empathy is so important, because if you just acknowledge that you're human before you're anything else, then you connect with another human at the level of you both being the same. Whereas if you're an Irish human, then you have history when you look at an English human. If you're a white human, you have history when you look at someone of a brown human. So I think it's very interesting it's funny, you know, across your recent novels and your work with the narrative, you know, obviously your work as an author is to induce empathy. You know, your books won't matter a damn if we don't care about your characters. You know, your work around the narrative is empathy. The identity thing as well. I mean, I think you wrote, I don't know whether it was an essay or an article, you know, who knows an Irish Jew? I actually responded going, I do. I actually worked with some. And I knew them through my acting. Shimmy Marcus is a fabulous director. And then I suppose got to know some of his family, etc. But it kind of is a rarity. But that's another book that is on my to be read list. I haven't read it yet, but that's Nine Folds Make a Paper Swan. Is that right?
Yeah. That was the previous one.
Correctly.
2016 it came out.
And what's fantastic is, like, you know, I see it's funny, we can't help. Maybe it's just the empathy. I think sometimes it's interesting. I was a counsellor for a while for the Rape Crisis Centre. And when I went to study psychology, my original driver was to become a clinical psychologist, you know, to treat patients one-to-one. But through the counselling, particularly the Rape Crisis Centre, I realised that I had too much empathy and I could handle I could access it very easily. And that's probably, I think, one thing that I was able to draw on as an actor, you know, because it is about, you know, being able to access those feelings very easily. So sort of there was a journey there for me in realising that whilst, you know, counselling individuals on the phone, you know, it was good for them at the time, it wasn't necessarily good for me. And ultimately in the longer term, I think too much empathy can interfere with progress for, you know, in a counselling situation.
That's really interesting. Yeah, that's a good way.
Yeah. But anyway, I learned about myself that I need to make a difference. That's absolutely critical to me. My work needs to have impact. But what I realised then over time is that I can have that in different ways. It doesn't have to be one-to-one. Initially, I thought I would have it through research. I still do research and I still think that's important. But actually, I found my impact, you know, through my talks, through my animations that I make, through the books, through spreading, you know, information and empowering people. They can do whatever they want with it afterwards. But it comes from sort of the same place. So I think identity is interesting. And I think that kind of goes back as well with your own identity as you were growing through your teenage years. You know, as you grew, your identity changes. It's not a single thing. And, you know, that's, you have a need to write different books now. And I'm sure that will change, you know, as you go forward as well, as you explore, you know, different topics or face different things in your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm already working on number 6 and it's something totally different again. So yeah, I like to
fantastic
to jump around.
You can't share anything about that yet.
I know. I mean, I'm kind of happy to. I mean, it's really early days, but this is moving actually, ironically, a little bit closer to home again. But it's a novel about a woman who is in her early 30s trying to figure out whether or not she wants to become a mother. And it's jumping around a lot in time with her relationship with her own mother. And also she's an artist. So there's a lot in there about kind of making art, making babies. What's it all about? So yeah, very much inspired by.
Right. So you'll have to listen to, I spoke to one of my other guests on this podcast is Joanne McNally, the comedian. And so I spoke to her about that. We met actually on a documentary, which you might be able to catch on Player because it was replayed again only about a week or two ago. And it's called Baby Hater. And so Joanne McNally was going through sort of something, you know, similar in, you know, well, do I need to have a baby? Do I have it and have a career? And, you know, she was kind of concerned she didn't have maternal instinct. And I was sort of brought on as the psychologist, you know, or the neuroscientist to give that perspective. And I was sort of saying to her, well, I wouldn't expect you to have maternal instinct till you actually have a baby. It's the drive to have a baby that you're talking about. And that's very different. And that has changed because we now have control over if and when we have a baby, but as women only up to a certain point. So you have a body clock talking at you and trying to distinguish between whether it's your body clock talking, whether you're having a natural drive, or whether you feel a societal pressure to be a mother or not. It's a fascinating topic. So you might find actually, we chat a little bit about it I think, in the podcast, but the documentary is of interest.
Oh, I'll definitely look that up. Thank you.
Yeah. And I mean, I have several friends who chose not to have kids, and that's a really, really, and I'm glad you're covering that topic, and maybe we'll come back and talk about that again, because so many societies define women by motherhood in a way, and a presumption that if you don't have kids, you're either infertile, barren, or actually you're a baby hater, if you know what I mean. That you're someone who is somehow that means something else, So it's a really interesting topic to explore, and I'm sure it will really resonate with lots of people.
Well, let's hope. But it's very strange it's always the way when a new book comes out, I'm kind of knee deep in thinking about and starting on the next one. So part of my brain is thinking about babies and art and what it means to be a woman, and then I go back and I do interviews about the butchers, and I'm like, oh yes, mad cow disease, yes, that's what I need to talk about. So it's quite weird flipping between the two and being like, which one am I thinking about now?
Yeah. I know, because in the midst of all this, my next book is due on the 30th of April.
Oh, lovely, good.
But that's funny. It's been challenging. You see, that's what's interesting too about how you write. I mean, I know a lot of novelists and writers have to do research of sorts, but then some don't. It's very much writing. My writing involves a lot of research, and I could feel that with you, like with your the one about the Irish Jewish population. You did a lot of research to try and immerse yourself in that and understand it. So your books are very informed, and it's, I don't know whether it's to do with your academic background that or integrity maybe is what it is, that your first few books were very much from your own experience, informed by your own experience, but then you move on and other people's lives interest you and you want to be authentic, and so you do considerable research to understand that, and now you're sort of coming back to write about something that's very relevant in your own life, but you're doing it in a very research focused way. Yeah,
that's absolutely it. And I think you're right in identifying those two motivations. I think on the one hand, like the kind of more research based books, as you would call them, like I am just, part of it comes from curiosity, and I think it is, as you say, an academic background. I love the research portion. I love spending weeks on end in the British Library rifling through old archives and reading books and finding out things that I didn't know about. And I love also going out and interviewing people and meeting people and learning about their background and their culture and their world, whether that's, as you say, a member of the Irish Jewish community, or whether that's a farmer who has a small cattle farm up in Monaghan. I love just chatting to people and learning about their worlds. So part of it is to do with just curiosity, and as I said, being a bit of a nerd who likes doing all the research. But then the other side, as you say, is to do with integrity and trying to get it right. And if you are choosing to take that leap to write beyond your personal experience, I think, there are perils and pitfalls, and you have to do it in a thoughtful and informed and careful and meticulously researched way. So it's kind of a twofold approach, but as I said, I do really, really love it.
Yeah, well, never use your curiosity. And I think we could, along with empathy, because I think they kind of are linked, you can't create empathetic characters unless you're curious about them and understand how they tick, really, and that's at the storytelling associated with your narrative 4. That's what it's about. It's about being curious about another person and saying, well, why do you do that? What is it about that? What is your story? And the thing is, our entire lives are about stories. Who we are is just a story that we tell ourselves, and sometimes that story that we tell ourselves about who we are has been influenced by things that other people have said to us, and I think that's very empowering, because actually if you take that time and question your own story, you can change your own futures or even your own past, and kind of revisit it. And that's why I think storytelling has survived so long in human culture, human society, is because it is a way for us to connect as social beings, but a way for us to move forward and kind of work together.
Yeah, I think that's completely true. And I also just want to add that, and this is not not. This is probably a discussion for another day, but I think it's one of the things that in both my most recent novels, I also find that playing out on like a national level. I think the story, especially within the context, you already mentioned the idea of Irishness, what that even means. I think the story that we tell about our country, or the stories that we've told about it in the past, and how even in recent years we've started to tell a slightly different story. I think that's so interesting to kind of think about, and how we kind of, the myths we tell ourselves, and then the, kind of unpicking them a little bit, and acknowledging some things that we've been keeping hidden. And yeah, I think it works on an individual level, but also in a national level as well.
Oh, absolutely. And national being a word like nationalism, and sort of teasing that apart. And I mean, I think I read in one of your essays, you were talking about, don't ask me to remember the title. It had a word, narratology or something in it, that I kind of went, okay, I have to look that one up. But I think you mentioned, and I just thought it kind of jumped out at me, that you mentioned, I think you quoted from Salman Rushdie, and he was talking about the dissolution of borders around the globe. And, that the way we are and the way we live in society, the borders have dissolved. Now, that was from actually really only sort of a few years ago. And actually how our narrative has changed, where you have world leaders talking about building up borders. And then we now have, and I'm referring to Trump and Mexico and that type of narrative. But now we're living through, this pandemic, and borders have become something else, something entirely different, not about nationalism, not about countries, but about containing a disease. And I'm kind of wondering how that will play out.
Yeah, and also back to our discussion about empathy, I think this idea that at the moment we are all literally physically being encouraged to stay separate from one another, and the kind of potential implications that has on, kind of erecting divisions as opposed to a sense of connection, is potentially scary.
Yeah, it's fascinating though. I think because we all have to isolate, there's a sense of connection.
Yeah, I hope so. I hope that's correct.
We're kind of in the same boat. However, I think it's very, very dangerous territory. And I did a small podcast at one of my booster shots on loneliness. It changes the brain. Being isolated from other humans changes how your brain functions. And actually interesting, and I've just realized this now as I'm talking to you, interestingly, what happens when you're isolated from society for whatever reason. Loneliness really is just a warning like hunger to say you need to get connected. However, it becomes chronic, and if it becomes chronic, what happens is because your brain sort of realizes that we don't do well in isolation. There's nobody else in the group to protect you. It doesn't let you go into full deep sleep. It also basically really what happens is your fear centers ramp up, and you start to see fear where there is none. You also sort of lose some of your social skills, and you become less empathetic.
Oh, there you go.
So, yeah, you do. So when you connect with other people, because there's that kind of myth that, when people are socially isolated or, on the edges of society, and people sort of say, oh, well, they're an odd one. They're odd anyway. They kind of know social skills. And the research would say that people don't become socially isolated because they've poor social skills. It's when you become isolated and lonely, you lose your social skills, but also you lose that natural empathy, where if you and I were speaking face to face, we would be, and I'm doing it here anyway, I'm nodding when you say certain things, and I'm kind of smiling in agreement when you say other things. They're very natural, empathetic responses. They're sort of shut down if you've been isolated for a long time, because your brain really has you in high alert. You don't know whether you can trust this person. Keep your distance. Don't trust what they're saying. And so your empathy goes down. And that's very, very important to remember. And I think it's something that we'll have to work on. If and when we do get back to a more regular society, is to be very conscious that we are going to be mistrustful and less empathetic perhaps than we had been in the past. And I think it's something we should be working on through this, which I think thankfully we have things like Zoom. I loved your book launch. I saw it online. You had, just to explain, Ruth's, as with many authors, I feel so sorry for so many people working up towards your book launch and then you can't have one. But you innovatively had one on Zoom, and you had about 100 people at your book launch, this fabulous screen full of people.
It was actually, I found it truly quite emotional. It was like, yeah, I mean, we had like 100 little screens, but there were a few people in each of them. So I think it was more than 100 faces.
Wow.
And all from all over the world, cousins from Abu Dhabi and friends from Australia and pals from California all logged in to toast the book. And, you know, I made a little speech and my editor made a little speech. And yeah, it was really moving. And actually what was really moving was afterwards, you know, lots of people sent me nice messages to say congrats, blah, 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 but also to say, wow, I really enjoyed that and I really needed that. Like, I think feeling part of something communal, like obviously having, you know, you have your chats on Zoom or FaceTime or whatever with your family members or friends, and there might be a couple of you on the screen, but that idea of being part of, I suppose, what we would refer to now as a mass gathering, feeling that kind of air of something communal, I think people found really affecting. So I'm so glad that the whole occasion was not just beneficial to me, but that actually it seemed a lot of people got something out of it, which was really lovely.
No, it is. And I think we need more and more people doing it. And I gave a talk the other night. And actually, if I have to do it again, I'm going to say, please, can you put some faces screens on the screen so that I feel like I'm actually, you know, that I'm getting the feedback? Because that's what I miss actually from my talks is not so much the giving the talks, but it's the audience to see their faces and sort of move with that. But I think I'm reading a lot online, which is the good side of these things, is that people are connecting. And I've been doing it myself, connecting via Zoom or whatever that party one is, or whatever app that it is you use. But they're actually connecting with people that maybe they've been meaning to connect with for a while and haven't gone round to do it in person. It's actually easier to do it, you know, to do it from your home. I had one, I mean, I've gone out for drinks with friends and I've even put my makeup on and dressed up, even though I'm sitting in my living room.
Yeah.
But like I've met friends, you know, where two of them are in London, one in the north of Ireland, one in Howth, and myself here in Clontarf, and you know, had a lovely time. And I think we have to do more of that. I just feel very, very sorry for some of the people who aren't online and connected in that way. And I think we have to find a way to do that. I think there has to be, you know, someone has to deliver, you know, iPads or something and say, look, you just press that button and you will be connected.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point, because I think it's like sometimes we can be a bit, you know, naive to the fact that, oh yeah, the whole world is connected and everyone's got Wi-Fi. And, you know, even like I work at a university, and even at the moment they're trying to figure out what to do about students and assignments that are due and the exams in the summer and all of that. And
yeah, we may not even be going back to university in September.
Yeah, that's what we're being told as well. But,
yeah.
you know, and, you know, the idea that actually we have to work off the assumption that there will be some students who don't have access to online materials or whatever. And I think that's quite sobering, because I think you just kind of do slightly live in your kind of, you know, first world bubble, and thinking that, everyone, this is, thank God this happened in a technological age, but actually not everyone has the access to the things that we're talking about.
No, and from my perspective, you know, in the area that I'm kind of working, you know, I mean, you know, plenty of over 70s are online, but plenty aren't, and over 80s. And they're the ones who have been told, you know, to stay inside, and they're actually following the rules probably too much. You know, they're not, you know, there's stories of people who haven't spoken to anyone for weeks. And that's, you know, that's as likely to kill them as, you know, COVID-19. So we have to find ways to get those people connected. So anyway, I should sort of wind this towards a close. One thing that I do say, Ruth, and I ask a lot of my guests, is ask guests whether there is any tips that they would like to share, whether it's from their life experience, whether it's around if you wanted to be a writer, or if people wanted to get involved in, you know, narrative 4, or, you know, anything really that you want to say that you'd like to share with people.
Right. I think I have two suggestions to make at this point. The first is pretty simple. I would really urge you to just check out narrative4.com, the number 4.com, and to learn about the organization, what they do. You know, that their work is incredible, and as I said, it's spreading all over the world, and it's very active in Ireland and increasingly in the UK. And I think, you know, as Sabina and I have been talking about, so many different people, communities, groups could benefit from connecting with others and developing their empathy. So I just think get in touch, because there's ways that you can get involved in the organization and bring them to you. My kind of life mantra, I suppose, and I can't believe I'm admitting that I have a life mantra, but in general, my rule of thumb is don't do things by halves. I'm a big believer that if you're going to do something, just throw yourself in 110%. And even if it doesn't work out, I admitted earlier to the book I wrote that never saw the light of day, to other things I've tried and failed. These are the things that you never hear about with people, but I guarantee you every successful person out there has a million failed ventures tucked away in a drawer somewhere. But I just think, I would rather try and fail than to only half-heartedly give it a go and it not work out. So I believe in kind of launching myself 110% into everything, whether it ends up coming to fruition or not.
And that's kind of, I call this podcast Super Brain because it's not about being brainy at all, but it's about actually harnessing your brain so you can reach your true potential, optimize who you are. And I think that's really what you're talking about there as well. It's just give it your best shot, just go for it. And I think that's absolutely fantastic advice, because the fact of the matter is, when you are giving something your best shot, you're lost in the moment, you're doing it and you're enjoying life. And even if you do something like, as you said, you had that novel that you say never got published, but you learned a huge amount from it.
Yeah, so much. And I just think also it's just the best way not to have any regrets looking back, because I think, if you do only give something, a half-hearted go, almost because you're second guessing against the fact that it might not work out, you'll never know looking back whether actually, if you'd given it your all, it might have been a success. So I just think, it does mean that you're more liable to look back and have regrets or things that you didn't pursue 100%. Whereas if you go for it and it doesn't work out, you'll always know, well, look, I tried and it didn't happen, but there's nothing more I could have done. So I just think that's a more, just a better way to live, I suppose.
Yeah, I think, and I think you're so right, because the second guessing yourself, I think sometimes if you just question that, why are you second guessing yourself? And you often find it. One of my other guests was Hilary Fanon, the columnist and also author, but she kind of said she held on to something that she was told in school at the age of 4, pretty much you're stupid and you're weak. Oh, yeah. And she is an Irish Times columnist. She's written a memoir, and her book, you have to check it out.
Oh, I know. My mother she's just finished it and she's supposed to be posting it over to me.
Oh, it's fantastic. Absolutely fantastic read. And I can understand why it might resonate with your mother as well. It's kind of, there's that, Hilary would be the same age as me too, but it's a beautifully written book. So I think it will resonate with anybody, because it's about very real people. But she let that story that she was told as a child influence her for years in the believing that, she, wasn't good enough. And sometimes that's where the self-limiting thoughts come from, or from what others might think.
Yeah. Yeah.
Who cares?
Yeah.
Who cares? You're the one who has to live with yourself, and you've only got one life. Ruth, it's just been so fantastic to reconnect with you. You're an absolute inspiration. What you've achieved already in life, I can't imagine what's going to come next. I so look forward to it, and I will continue following your career like any mother would.
Oh no, Sabina, it's been an absolute joy. I can natter to you all day long. So thank you so much for having me. It's been really, really a pleasure.
Ruth is one to watch, not only as an author and academic, but also as an activist. I have a feeling that she will do great things and continue to have impact. Her work with Narrative 4 is, I think, just the first step towards making a difference on a grand scale. I'll include links to Ruth's website and Narrative 4 in the show notes for this episode. My name is Sabina Brennan, and you've been listening to Super Brain, the podcast for everyone with a brain. Subscribe on Acast, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember, if you enjoyed it, rate it, like it, and share it. Stay safe.